You're listening to the Grace Plus Zero podcast, exploring the crossroads of culture, faith, and family from a biblical worldview. And now your host.
For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3, 4, and 5. Welcome to Grace Plus Zero. I'm your host, Brian Moore. It is Thursday, August the 29th, 2019, and we welcome you to the program. And on today's program, we're going to be talking about postmodernism, a topic that everyone needs to be familiar with, especially if you consider yourself a Christian. And we're going to reference the particular verses that the Apostle Paul was that I read a minute ago from the book of Corinthians, 2 Corinthians. We're going to talk about that, and we're going to look at postmodernism from a historical perspective and try to put a finger on what's going on in the world around us. But before we do that, however, we'd like to remind you that you can subscribe to our podcast by going to Spreaker, Grace Plus Zero. You can also download the podcast from iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Podbean, Podchaser, Podaddict, just a whole host of sources wherever it is that you might be able to get your podcast fix. We're also available on YouTube, and if you want to listen to the show there, it is Grace Plus Zero, and we encourage you to follow us on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @Grace Plus Zero, all one word, as well as our Facebook page, which is @Grace Plus Zero. And as always, we like to remind you that you'd like to drop us an email. You can do so at gpzpodcast@gmail.com. All right, let's get straight to the show here. Postmodernism. You've probably heard the word, probably haven't given it much consideration, because usually when you do hear it, you probably think that people are referencing art, sculptures, things of that nature. But that's not exactly all that it encompasses. As a matter of fact, you're going to find out as we discuss this that postmodernism is the why to the questions that you probably are asking right now. The questions that you look out in society and you see things happening and you say, it seems as if the world is turned upside down. What in the world is going on? If you're anything like myself, you've probably caught yourself saying this sometime in the past. And chances are, most of the time when you say it, it probably is a result of the current culture that we live in, and it's called postmodernism. In reference to postmodernism, it is basically the spirit of the age. It's the way things are today. And we're going to get into it here and talk to you just a little bit about it. When we started, we read from 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3, 4, and 5. And the Apostle Paul said, "For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations, and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ." The Apostle Paul is indicating here something in regards to spiritual warfare. And oftentimes when people think of spiritual warfare, they think of some sort of incantation or saying, "Get thee behind me, Satan," or something of that nature. And that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about that type of thing here today. That's not what the Apostle Paul was referencing either. Real spiritual warfare is not fought with just saying a phrase. It's not fought with uttering a variety of utterances or or things, or saying, just get thee behind me, Satan. That's all well and good, but it's not that type of thing. Spiritual warfare is fought with the truth. It allows us to tear down the systems of ideas, and it's not necessarily a warfare versus people. It is a warfare against ideologies and or ideas, if you will. The Apostle Paul, when he in the 10th chapter here, when he says, "For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh," he's indicating here that this type of warfare is not to be fought in the same way that a carnal warfare would be fought, not with weapons. Because the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but they are mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. Our weapons are things like prayer. Our weapons are trusting in the Lord. But in this particular case here, the weapon is truth that the Apostle Paul is referencing. When he says casting down imaginations, there's a lot of vain and crazy imaginations out there in the world today, and we can combat those imaginations with the truth. He also goes on to say, "And every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God." We're hearing a lot of stuff this day and time that contradicts common sense. It contradicts reason. It contradicts logic, and most importantly, it contradicts truth. These particular things are exalting themselves above the knowledge of God, and we are to use the truth of God to fight against these things. He goes on to say, "And bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ." So the situation that we're facing out there in the world today is much like the situation and the advice that the Apostle Paul was given. This is a spiritual warfare. Do not be fooled and think that it is not. What is happening within our culture is very real, and it is very evil, and it is very much antithetical to anything related to God and the Word of God. And we are to fight and combat these things with truth, and always do it whenever possible in peace and in love. Sometimes people will tell you, well, you're being opinionated or you're being judgmental. I've indicated before and told you that being judgmental when it comes to condemning someone, only God can do that. We're not in the condemnation business, but we have been told what truth is, and there is nothing wrong with us rightly judging or discerning what is true, what is right, and what is wrong, and standing upon the walls of Zion and crying loud and sparing not. So there's nothing wrong with that. But we're going to take a look at postmodernism and just try to, if we can, kind of create an illustration or paint a picture and explain a little bit about what it is, so perhaps that you will have a better understanding of what's happening in the world around you. Postmodernism is basically an ideology that is rooted in a belief that if truth does exist, notice I said that if truth does exist, that it is impossible for anyone to actually know what truth is. A real, true postmodernist will never tell you that truth does not exist, but they will tell you that it is impossible for anyone to know truth. So what is postmodernism? Well, basically in world history, if we were to take recorded history that we are aware of, and we were to break it down, what we would find is basically there's three intellectual periods of history, and these three intellectual periods can, for the most part, be defined as pre-modern era, the modern era, and then of course what we are now calling the postmodern era. So if you are listening, and maybe if you've got a notepad or something like that, I mean, some people do better when they take notes, if you are going to take notes, make a little grid, something that looks like a tic-tac-toe grid with 9 blocks, and block it off. And then at the top left block, you could actually put the word pre-modernism. In the middle block, you could put the word modernism. And in the block to the right, you would put post-modernism. And let's take a look at pre-modern era. During the pre-modern era, which was, like I said, is an intellectual era that took place, most people would suggest that it started, goes back as far as Adam and Eve, all the way up until about the 17th century, late 1600s, early 1700s possibly. And it was basically a period of history in which we were, our frame of thought and our worldviews were shaped and molded by a particular viewpoint and an understanding. Now, we'll go back and suggest that some people do not say that it goes all the way back to Adam. Some people say it goes all the way back to the beginning of recorded history, which is about approximately 5,000 years ago. Some people say it only goes back 2,000 years. There's no way to put a finger on it and actually nail it down, but just for the sake of argument, I wanted to clarify that there is no specific dates that you can actually equate with when one started and the other actually began. But nonetheless, somewhere in around the 17th century, the end of the pre-modern era started winding down. And in the pre-modern era, basically, regardless of where you was at in the world, what people believed was the general understanding was that there was a spiritual world, that there was some type of afterlife, that there was some type of transcendent creator or creators, depended on where you lived at in the world, whether you believed in, if you were monotheistic or polytheistic. But nonetheless, people believed that there was a spiritual presence, there was a spiritual world. And in this particular mindset, there was basically no question regarding, no general question regarding the nature of spirituality. Spirituality was, the spiritual realm, was a very real thing. In the pre-modern era, the authority of all things lay somewhere in the spiritual realm. Like I said, whether you was monotheistic, polytheistic, or if you were Christian, if you were Jewish, if you were Hindu, if you were Buddhist, it really didn't matter. You believed that the authority for all truth lie within the spiritual realm. Truth was a very real thing. People believed that truth was real. They believed that truth was absolute. So much so that they believed that truth was universally absolute. So whatever was true for everyone. It wasn't just true to the Hindu, it was true for everyone. It wasn't just true to the Christian, it was true for everyone, regardless of where they were at. This transcendent force, which you and I would know as God, was the authority of all truth. And it was rarely questioned. As far as the general knowledge of society, this was just how it was. Truth was real. It was possible to know truth. And truth came from an authority, and that authority was something that was transcendent, that was within the spiritual realm. And for example, the God of the Bible, of course, is transcendent of all things. And the God of the Bible, and speaking from the Jewish perspective, speaking from the Christian perspective, the God of the Bible was the author and the finisher of all truth. And to know God was to know truth, of course, but people just did not question the authority. And this was the way things went for up until, like I said, around the 17th century, late 17th century. And then we gradually began to enter into what became known as the modern era. And the modern era, in some ways, was a product of the Enlightenment period. And during the Enlightenment period, man began to look at basically the physical world much differently than he had before. This is the Enlightenment movement is the one that is largely responsible for the American Revolution, the French Revolution. It gave us such philosophers as John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Montesquieu, Rousseau, all of these men who were questioning many truths that we had considered to be absolute truth for a very long period of time. And during the modern era, secularism began to take a little bit more of a hold. People began to question authority. And of course, with understanding of that, questioning authority, it helps you better understand why the American Revolution started. We questioned the authority and the legitimacy of the idea that kings receive their power from God, what is commonly referred to as the divine right of kings. People for a long period of time, just assumed that the authorities were from the spiritual realm. But in and around the Enlightenment period, and as things began to change, and we morphed into what we call the modern era, man became a little bit more proud of himself. We had more scientific discoveries. We found out that some things that we believed to be absolutely true were not true. And during the modern era, there was a gradual change. People still believed in the transcendent spiritual realm. They still believed, for the most part, in God. People believed that truth was knowable, that you could find out what truth is, that it was something that we could seek and attain. The major difference during the modern era as compared to the pre-modern era is that during the modern era, instead of the authority of all truth being God or coming from the spiritual realm, the authority of all truth came from science. And during this period, if science could prove it, then we believed it and accepted it as true. And this was the modern era lasted, and it's also questionable as to how long it lasted. But I want to point out that in that top left column there that I was telling you about the pre-modern era, if you want to be real easy on it, just say that there was a spiritual realm. And the top middle column, you would put that again. There was a spiritual realm. People did believe in it. Now, if you go down to the pre-modern era and you go to the next column down, you could just write down the words that truth was knowable. Truth was real and absolute and knowable. And you could repeat the same thing over in the modern era in the center column. Now, if you go down to the third column, of course, on the left-hand side where the pre-modern era is at, you would just put down there that God was the source or the authority of all truth. And under modernism, if you went down to the bottom column, you would put that science is the authority for all truth. So with that being said, it leaves one column remaining, and that is the postmodern era. Now, when you get over to the postmodern era, things change considerably. The postmodern era is said to have began. Some people argue that it began shortly after World War II. Others will argue that it began somewhere around the mid to late 1980s or around the fall of the Berlin Wall, that we entered into the postmodern era. Some people consider Bill Clinton the first postmodern president. but nonetheless, somewhere after, we'll say, World War II, at least up until the present, we have been in the modern era. During the modern era, in that top column over there, we do not, in the modern era, the way of thinking, the worldview today is, we do not know if there is a spiritual realm. We do not, nobody knows if God is real. Nobody knows if the spiritual realm actually exists. And if you look at it and you compare it to the two other eras, in the two other eras, they did at least believe, in generally speaking, in the spiritual realm. In the postmodern era, they do not believe, for the most part, in the spiritual realm. Another characteristic of this postmodern era, if you move down to the next column there on your notes, if you'll look at it and jot this down, in the postmodern era, truth might exist, but if it does, we will never know what it is. Nobody has any way of knowing what truth is. So if you consider the pre-modern era, in which people believed that truth was absolute and truth was knowable, people believe the same thing during the modern era. They just use science to prove it. In the postmodern era, they don't necessarily believe that truth is knowable. They believe it, if it is real, it is not knowable. And then that leads us to the third part of the postmodernism. And if you went down to the bottom, well, what is the authority of truth? Well, in all honesty, there is no authority of truth, but if you remember, as we mentioned before, in the pre-modern era, the authority was God. In the modern era, the authority was science. And in the postmodern era, the authority for truth is self. It's the individual. You can put I, me, self, whatever you want in that box. And you're probably asking yourself the question, well, if there's no way we can know what truth is, then how is the individual the authority on truth? Well, you've probably heard people say, you've heard this phrase, it's much more common today than it ever was before, my truth, your truth. They believe that in the postmodern era, generally, people, especially people that subscribe to this, and some people don't even know they subscribe to it, they believe that all truth is relative. All truth is relative to the individual. In other words, if it's not true to you, it's not true. It's sort of like saying, whatever I say is correct, it's true, but it's my truth. And if you say something is true, it's your truth. And we both are correct. This is one of the main reasons that you are seeing so many people today argue that they are being offended. The reason they say they're offended is because they do not believe that anyone has the right to argue that their truth or that they have access to absolute truth. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about here, and we'll take a quick break. Imagine a baseball umpire. If a baseball umpire was calling a game in the pre-modern era, of course we all know what balls and strikes are, a baseball umpire would just simply say, okay, they're balls and they're strikes, and I will call them as they are. In the modern era, a baseball umpire would say they're balls and strikes, and I call them as I see them. But in the postmodern era, a baseball umpire would say, I decide if it is a ball or if it is a strike. And whatever I say it is, it is. In other words, he could pitch one really high and to the left or high and to the right, and the umpire decides to call it a strike. It is a strike because he says it's a strike. And this is why so many people today are saying that they are, men are saying that they are women, women are saying that they are men, and anyone that questions these things, well, you're considered part of the problem. Because after all, who are you to have access to the truth? We'll be back right after these messages. All right, welcome back to the show. We're talking postmodernism, and we just got through using an analogy about a baseball umpire. Let's talk a little bit more about postmodernism. I know that you're probably a whole lot like me. You hear things happening in the news, and you read things, and it just absolutely drives you up the wall, and you say, what's going on? Is the world crazy? Well, no, it's not crazy. It's postmodernism. If you argue that you know something is right or something is wrong or something is true or something is absolute, in this day and time, you're going to get shot down in flames. As a matter of fact, some of the most vicious attacks that people have, and I think it was the last episode, we discussed the actor Mario Lopez, who had made a comment that 3-year-olds did not need to be determining their gender and didn't need to be making those types of decisions at the age of 3, and he was eviscerated. He was literally raked over the coals, and the Twitter sphere just tore him up and down, and he nearly lost his job because the spirit of the age is telling us, you cannot tell me what is right and wrong. I decide what's right and wrong. Telling people that you know what the truth is this day and time is sort of like telling them that vanilla is the best flavor of ice cream. They're going to look at you just like I would and say, well, that's your opinion. I think chocolate's better. Telling them the truth to this day and time is perceived as an opinion. It's perceived as an opinion because the only arbiters of truth in this postmodern society that we live in is the individual. And if you stop and do some analysis on this, you will come to the realization pretty quick that if there is no such thing as truth, or even if there is truth, if nobody can know what it is, and everybody has their own truth, then ultimately anything goes in this society. And what's really interesting about this is we see so many things that are abominations to God, so many things that are blasphemous, so many things that are perversions within our society, and they can just continue to get worse and worse and worse, and people are silenced from speaking up. People will not call these things what they are for fear of what will happen. If this continues to go in the direction that it's going, and I would argue that it will. After all, the apostle said that things would continue to wax worse and worse, and I think we've only reached the tip of the iceberg. We haven't even seen how much of it's under the water yet. Things are going to get pretty bad. This postmodern society that we have is basically teaching us, it's teaching our children, that there are no absolutes. There is no purpose to life. There is no truth, and if there is, you'll never know it. There's no room for growth in this postmodern society. Nothing is real. Everything is only what you think it is. It's all relative to you, the individual. It leads to a very nihilistic society in which there just seems to be no hope. It's despair and hopelessness. That's what it is. It's despair and hopelessness. And it's sort of like just throwing your hands up and just saying whatever. Because anyone who criticizes or critiques anything that appears to be immoral now is the one who is deemed the one out of order or the one in the wrong. You don't have to be too smart to figure out where this leads us to as a society. In essence, man has attempted to make himself God, and we're living in a culture and a society that says that man is God. This particular viewpoint has already led us to suppressing the truth. People will not open their mouth and say what is true for fear of the backlash that will come with it. Can you imagine what society would be like if we lived like this for another 30 or 40 years? The deviancy, it will be just unbelievable what we will be witnessing in our society. It leads to reprobation. And the Bible plainly tells us, that God gave them over to a reprobate mind. Well, I'm going to tell you, a reprobate society becomes comfortable in its sin. And when it does, the only virtue that particular society deems a worthy virtue is tolerance. And that's why you hear so many people preaching tolerance, tolerance, tolerance. They want tolerance for their deviancy is what they want. And that's the direction that this particular era that we're living in is headed. There's nothing that you and I can do about it. It basically is nothing more than a cover for sin is what it is. A couple other things real quick about this postmodern era, and you probably will find it a little bit interesting, but I want this one thing for you to take home with you is to understand that modernism, this postmodern era that we live in, is totally, wholly, and completely incompatible with Christianity. There is no room for it whatsoever within our Christian lifestyle. You are seeing it creep into churches. You are seeing churches that are giving in to the pressure from different societies or communities out there that are pushing for these different things. They're giving in. They're modifying their modes of worship. They're allowing certain people in the pulpit that the Bible plainly says should not be in the pulpit. They're doing many things that they should not be doing, and all this is because they are giving in to this spirit of the age that we call postmodernism. Keep in mind that as with the pre-modern era, and then we move to the modern era, that man became less reliant on God when he entered into the modern era, and more reliant on science. Now we're being told that not even science is correct. We're told that religion doesn't have the answers. We're told that science doesn't have the answers. We're told the only person that has the answers is the individual themselves. The modern era gave us the nuclear bomb. The modern era gave us fascism. The modern era gave us communism. It gave us Darwinian evolution. The modern era gave us 2 world wars. It gave us the Holocaust. It gave us a lot of really bad things. And still, there was a remnant of people that believed in the spiritual realm, that believed in God. Now we're entering into the postmodern era, and there is no place for God. Allow your imagination to see where this is going. If the modern era was reprobate, imagine what the postmodern era holds for us. We've only began to see what's happening. We'll be back right after these messages. All right, welcome back to the show. A little bit longer show this evening because of the discussion on postmodernism. But there's a couple little news articles wanted to mention for you to check out. Planned Parenthood has decided to drop Title X funding, and Title X funding is funding that comes from the federal government that covers a variety of treatments and programs for underprivileged or women who are perhaps in poverty and are living in poverty zones and so forth. The reason that Planned Parenthood is declining to accept the Title X funding is because the Title X funding will not, they will not give any money to the organization if Title 10 funding will not be given to any organization that schedules or advises someone to have an abortion. So even though this funding would help women get a wide variety of medical treatments that they need, a lot of really good healthcare services, they have decided not to accept the money because they can't do those treatments and suggest abortions at the same time. So it tells you a whole lot about Planned Parenthood. It's almost like saying there's 9 things you can do. You can't do the 10th one. And Planned Parenthood is basically saying, if we can't do the 10th one, we're not going to take the money and do any of them. So there'll be a lot of women that won't get this funding simply because Planned Parenthood is trying to make a political statement. Another thing, real quick in the news, was archaeologists have actually discovered what appears to be the first church of the apostles. This just came out in the Christian headlines this past week. They found this particular church during an archaeological dig near the Sea of Galilee. And according to this team of archaeologists, which is comprised of American and Israeli researchers, they discovered made these findings near the city of Bethesda. And if you remember reading in the Bible, this is Bethesda. This is near where the Lord healed the blind man. They made this discovery there, and it is believed that there was a bishop who had actually built, I think it was a church, over the house of where Peter and Andrew had lived, and they were some of the first disciples. And the discovery is pretty much spot on. Archaeologists, almost everyone is in a total agreement that this is most definitely the church that they did originally meet at. And it's a pretty neat find. It's something that you're not going to hear much about on the major news networks, but probably because it debunks a lot of their postmodern viewpoints. But it is a really interesting discovery, and it's something worth checking out. So if you have time, go to Christian Headlines and look it up. Archaeologists discovered this particular location near the Sea of Galilee, and they're pretty sure it's where Andrew and Stephen had a church established. All right, welcome back again. Like I said, we're kind of zipping through this here, but I wanted to share a few more Bible facts with you. Today we're going to be talking about some Bible facts about some of the dead that were raised in the Bible. There may be more than this, but at least there appears to be about 10 places in the Bible where people were actually raised from the dead. If you remember, Elijah raised the widow's son in 1 Kings. Elisha raised the Shunammite's son in 2 Kings. A dead man came to life. If you remember when Elisha's bones were thrown into the pit, that was in 2 Kings. Jesus raised the widow's son in Luke 7. He raised the daughter of Jairus in Luke 8. Of course, we all know Lazarus. He raised him in John 11. You can read that one. And, of course, Jesus himself was resurrected, and all the Gospels give account of that. And then we also can read over in Matthew 27 about many of the saints that came out of the graves after Jesus' resurrection. And then we have Tabitha, in which Peter raised in the book of Acts in the 9th chapter, and in Eutychus that Paul raised in Acts chapter 20. So there's 10 different examples of people being raised from the dead, and one of the thoughts that come to my mind is the book of Hebrews that speaks about some of the saints dying, having not received the promise, but dying in hope of the promise and in hope of a better resurrection. And I always go back to this, and if you look at those different resurrections that are referenced there, all of those people that I mentioned, they were resurrected, but they lived to die again. except for one of them, and his name is Jesus. And Jesus Christ raised from the dead, never to die again. The Bible says, and now that he lives unto God, never to die again. So it's a beautiful thought, and we live in hope of that better resurrection as well. And I believe anyone's ever felt the effectual calling of the Spirit of God knows what it means to be raised from a dead state unto a lively hope. Well, there's a morning coming when it's not going to be raised from just a dead state to a lively hope, but we're going to be raised. These corruptible bodies are going to be put on incorruption. These bodies that go down weak, they're going to be raised in power, and we're going to put on a glorified body and go home to be with our King forever and ever. And that's the morning and the resurrection that we all long for. I'll be back in just a second with parting shots. All right. Several years ago, Linda Lee Stassen Benjamin penned a Christian worship song titled "Sing Hallelujah to the Lord." And when she did, OPEC had an embargo against the United States. And if those of you that were alive in the 1970s, remember how hard it was to get fuel. Eventually what happened was United States and America shortly thereafter set down for disarmament. India had just got through testing an atomic device. Richard Nixon had just been impeached. It was really a tumultuous time. But that particular song that she penned 45 years later has a major relevance, and it's happening right now. And it's a shame that we're not getting a lot of coverage from it in the media. It was originally, the song itself, "Sing Hallelujah to the Lord," was originally a tribute for Easter. And it became, as of recently, an anthem song for the protesters in Hong Kong. If you're not aware of what's going on over there, it is absolutely amazing. We have youth and we have people in the streets here in America, crying and supporting socialism and acting like it's one of the greatest things ever. And then there's people over in Hong Kong right now who are protesting against mainland China for their very freedom. And they're protesting by the thousands. And one of the songs that these people can be heard singing is this particular song, "Sing Hallelujah to the Lord." And it's so ironic that here we are in 2019, living in what's arguably the greatest country, the greatest political experiment that has ever took place. And we have people arguing and supporting, and I would argue an entire plethora of candidates who are self-admitted socialists, arguing and denouncing the very tenets and things that made this country a great nation, while we have people halfway across the world on the brink of communism singing hallelujah and praises to the Lord, waving the American flag, and reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. It is really it's a sad sight to see for us, but it's a wonderful sight to see those people over there walking together. They're united, and they're standing firm against this totalitarian government, and they are trusting in the Lord and trusting on the things that this nation should be trusting in. Well, that's all the time we have for today's program. Appreciate you tuning in. Remind you to please go to our YouTube page and hit that subscribe button if you would. If you get this on Spreaker or iTunes, wherever it is, share it with a friend. Let them know about the show. And please send us a comment or something, or drop us an email at gpzpodcast@gmail.com. And until next time, I am Brian Moore, reminding you that from the rising of the sun until the going down of the same, the name of the Lord shall be praised.